un sonido más claro. So welcome to everyone else who's still joining us. We come together virtually today from many different locations, and we recognize that we are on Indigenous lands and that the policies that we will be talking about today are part of a continuation of centuries of colonialism and plundering and racism. And for this workshop, SOA Watch is joining and collaborating with our sister organizations, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES, and the Central American Resource Center in Los Angeles, CARECEN. And we are excited to be hearing from Yesenia Portillo, who's the East Coast Regional Organizer with CISPES, as well as Xochitl Sanchez, the Refugee Project Organizer at CARECEN-LA, Lulu Matute, who's the Organizing Coordinator of SOA Watch, and myself. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Yesenia.
Thank you, Brigitte. So if we can just go back to the previous slide. So 2 more slides now. There, that one. So if you can go to the next slide, we're gonna, I'm gonna get started. So during their campaign, the Biden-Harris platform on immigration included a focus on addressing the root causes of migration, which we've continued to see through the White House's proposed immigration legislation and the White House plan for Central America. So thank you everybody for joining us, because during this presentation, we will take a look at how this plan is being promoted by the White House, by some Democrats, and in the mainstream as something novel, when in reality it legitimizes a recycling of decades, and let me turn on my video, I just realized, of decades, if not over a century, of US foreign policy that has always sought to establish and maintain economic and geopolitical control in the region. US foreign policy towards Central America, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, is increasingly discussed as a necessary part of the plan for curbing migration. What we've been hearing from Democrats is that in order to address the issue of mass flows of migrants to the US southern border, the US must solve the quote unquote root causes of why people are fleeing. And this is an appropriation of the demands coming from popular social movements in the region and grassroots solidarity organizations in the US, which have for decades denounced the destabilizing role of US intervention. The Biden administration is promoting this as, again, a novel strategy, using this language taken from progressive and radical groups about addressing the root of an issue in order to actually continue to center the political and economic interests of the US. And then Candace, if we can go to the next slide. So before taking a look at some of the specifics of the plan, I wanted to go over an example of how this is being discussed. And this is a 10-minute video of an MSNBC segment where the speakers react to Vice President Harris, a speech that Vice President Harris gave in Mexico City after receiving major backlash for telling migrants in Guatemala, "Do not come." In the press conference, Vice President Harris explained some of the work she's been doing within the framework of the White House plan for Central America. And if you can go to the next slide. If you get a chance to watch the full video, I invite folks to think about the following questions. What surprised you about the way the US relationship to Central America is discussed? What do the speakers pose as the cause of migrants fleeing from Central America? What are the solutions that are being presented? And given the context of the Vice President's "Do not come" message and her press conference in Mexico the following day, what conclusion do the host and interviewees come to about VP Harris's work around this issue? So we'll review just some excerpts that I pulled from the discussion.
Yesenia, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you, Soch. So here with these, we're going to review just some excerpts that I pulled from the discussion. And with these first two, you'll notice that Joy Reid does a really important job of acknowledging the long history of US profit-driven destabilization in Central America and its deep impacts. She mentions the United Fruit Company and the US-backed coup against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. And this is important progress, the growing acknowledgement of US history of violent economic interventions in Central America when discussing migration from the region is significant. Unfortunately, the analysis often assumes that this relationship is in the past, and we see that in this interview as well. So the quotes, she says, the United States used much of Central America as essentially a giant plantation. We overthrew the Guatemalan government, the CIA threw them out. They've had a corruption problem ever since. So we can go to the next slide. After several minutes dedicated to explaining the devastating impacts of decades of US corporate-driven foreign policy in the region, the speakers go on to explain how the US needs to now fix the economy, the instability, and the corruption, applauding VP Harris for these efforts. And so we see that here with these quotes. She said they're going, Vice President Harris said they're going to form an anti-corruption task force, which is very important. If we can help people actually make money and be able to earn a living safely, we can try to help them stay home because, again, people want to stay home. Next slide, please. And then Representative Espiat says, I think that we have to take a deep dive to find the root causes. And so here we have the language of root causes. We'll talk, and then the next quote, her going there is taking the first step, take a deep dive, find out what must be done to build public-private partnerships. And we'll talk a little bit more about public-private partnerships in the presentation. And then people want to stay with their families, but that requires investment. And so, of course, we have to ask what kind of investment, right? So the next slide. I also wanted to share a little bit about the context, to provide a little context about who the US is looking to partner with to ostensibly create the economic stability in the region. You'll notice Nestle, MasterCard, and Microsoft, among others in this coalition that started the NGO Partnership for Central America that is intended to drive practical solutions to advance economic opportunity. Next slide. And then here we see that the executive committee is made up of top leadership, CEOs, VPs of these different corporations. Next slide. So after being incensed by VP Harris's comments of do not come, Maria Hinojosa closes with, today was better, and I'm happy to hear that there's going to be such extraordinary investment. And Joy Reid closing with, yes, I mean, we have a long relationship and it's got to become a lot more integral because we do need to try to improve the economies. Next slide. So while it's necessary to acknowledge the history of US intervention and its impact, we also need to understand how current foreign policy promoted by the Biden administration is actually just a continuation of that. And so I wanted to briefly share a little bit of this timeline, and there's an Aviva Chomsky article in the Washington Post about the root causes of Central America and migration being the United States, and it's from July of this year. And this timeline takes a lot of important information from that article. So you see that this history that Joy Reid speaks to is on here, the United Fruit Company, the 1954 coup in Guatemala, and this page goes into foreign policy through the 80s with Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, the impacts, that in the 60s, and then the impacts of that, and then Reagan era doubling down on corporate-driven policy in the 80s. That really is a continuation of that same model, profit corporate-driven model. And here we see these policies have continued. If you go to the next slide. Oh, just kidding. This is it. So yeah, with this slide, we see that the policies have continued into the 2000s with the Central America Free Trade Agreement and the Alliance for Prosperity. The Trump era had America Crece, and now with the White House root causes of migration strategy with the Partnership for Central America. and Biden requesting a $4 billion worth of investment to promote profit-driven economic growth. So yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Brigitte to share more about what that looks like.
Thank you, Yesenia. And so, as Yesenia outlined, this plan is really just a continuation of the long history that was in that timeline. And one way of seeing that is if we look at the pillars that are in this plan that the Biden administration has proposed. And pillar one is called Addressing Economic Insecurity and Inequality, which sounds quite nice, right? But if you actually read what's in this pillar, it's just the same continuation of plundering, of promoting pro-corporate policies that benefit corporations, that benefit the oligarchy, and that actually will likely lead to more inequality. And so it's the same thing that the US has been doing, for decades, for centuries. So you can change to the next slide. And so if we read what's in the text of this pillar, it talks about implementing reforms to address structural impediments to growth, leveling the playing field for international businesses. And that shows us where the real interest is here. Next slide. Diversifying trade to include new export sectors, including those that reinforce US supply chains, right? And so this has been already a pillar of US policy towards Central America for decades. And now they're packaging it and planning and portraying it as something that is now going to address the root causes of migration, when in reality, these types of policies are a major root cause of the migration that is happening from the region. And one of the reasons that what Yesenia talked about with that interview is so important is because the mainstream media is just kind of eating up this co-opting of the narrative. And so we really have to understand what's going on and what's the real plan is, and to be able to cut through that. Because this is not aid. This is basically promoting policies that will enable corporations to profit, more privatization of water, privatization of natural resources for corporate profit, and that will lead to more dispossession and more inequality in the region. And so if we go to the next slide, this pillar about addressing the economic situation talks a lot about international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. And we have seen this time and time again, where these banks are basically being used to finance different projects, to finance policies, and also to promote policies that benefit corporations, that benefit the local kind of elite, the local ruling class in each country, and that lead to more inequality and more dispossession. And one example of this that really puts it into play is the example of the Jilamito River, which is a river in northern Honduras. And this river is, you can switch to the next slide actually. This project is to be financed by IDB Invest, which is a multilateral development bank that is referred to. And the thing about these banks is that the US has the dominant amount of shares, right? And so the US is really the most powerful actor in these multilateral development banks that other countries also own part of. And so the US really plays a driving role in determining what kind of projects these banks finance. And when we look at the case of the Jilamito River, there are communities in the region, in the municipality of Arizona, and they're organized in the broad movement for dignity and justice that have been defending this river for over 4 years. And they have faced a lot of repression. They have faced criminal charges for doing so. But this project was to be financed by the US Development Finance Corporation in the name of development, in the name of addressing migration. And it is still going to be financed by the IDB Invest, which is part of the InterAmerican Development Bank. But the reality between the rhetoric, or the difference between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground, could not be more stark. And so the communities that are defending the river, they would like the river to be preserved for drinking water and water that the local communities can use. They don't want it to be privatized for corporate profit. And they are literally putting their lives on the line to defend their river. And they have been doing that day in and day out for the past several years. And they presented numerous complaints to the Honduran prosecutor's office for everything from environmental damages to corruption in the permitting, to different illegalities related to the project and the permits. And not surprisingly, the Honduran authorities have not resolved their concerns. And the corruption aspect is important, and the next speaker is going to touch on this more, because there are many allegations of corruption, and in fact, two of the people who are involved in the parent company of this project were found by the US Embassy to basically be corrupt in a cable that came out through WikiLeaks, right? And so now we have the US was going to finance this. The Development Finance Corporation finally agreed not to finance this after a big campaign by the local communities, by the Broad Movement for Dignity and Justice, and by a lot of solidarity organizations. But the IDB Invest is still going to finance it, and US money is still involved in that way, right? It's just these multilateral banks give a cover, but in the end, the US has the controlling share there. And it's just so ironic, talk about opposing corruption as another pillar, but here you have the financing a project where people who are involved were actually found by the US Embassy to be involved in corruption, let alone, and then all the other environmental issues. And so the question about this narrative of being development is just such a false narrative, because people would not put their lives on the line to oppose a project if it were actually development for them, right? And so it is just basically a lie, the whole narrative. And this project also has many parallels to, or the whole situation surrounding this project has many parallels to the situation and the struggle of Berta Cáceres, who opposed another hydroelectric project that was internationally financed, the Agua Zacra project, before she was killed, and she was killed for opposing that project. And so you see these situations playing out again and again, and the US obviously has not learned and just continues to promote this type of project in the name of development, in the name of stopping migration, but in reality, it's essentially the opposite. And in fact, at least one person has had to seek asylum because of the repression that they faced for opposing the Jilamito hydroelectric project. And this is also a classic example of where the real interest lies in promoting US corporate interests, because there's a US company, which is Simons, that's based in Massachusetts, that is it's a significant owner of the parent company of this project. And it just kind of shows, well, Simons will, if this project is realized, will make a profit off of it, right? And there's going to be a day of action, actually very soon, coming up November 15th, organized by the Broad Movement for Dignity and Justice in Honduras, the Massachusetts Peace Action, the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective, and SOA Watch, calling on Simons to either ensure the project is canceled or to divest its ownership. And so that's something that we'll be sending out more information to folks after, if you'd like to participate in the day of action, and we'll be sharing that information later. And another example, and you can switch to the next slide, that I just want to briefly address, has to do with our third panel as well. In the third panel, we're going to be hearing from Miriam Miranda of Orphany, which is the Garifuna People's Organization in Honduras. And they have done phenomenal work in challenging the dispossession of their lands, right? And they've even won InterAmerican court rulings, basically ordering their lands to be returned to them. But the root of all of this, the root of basically the dispossession of their lands, dates back to World Bank impulsed policies that pushed land reforms that led to dispossession of Garifuna communities and many other indigenous communities in Honduras, right? And so when the Biden administration talks about these multilateral banks promoting policy reforms, this is the type of policy reforms they're talking about and that have happened and lead to real dispossession and lead to real migration. It's banks that are pushing privatization, that are pushing basically policies that end up dispossessing the majority of communities. And so we've seen that play out in the recent past, we're seeing it play out right now. And under this new plan that is proposed, even though the language is all about addressing inequality, in reality, it's going to lead to more inequality. And I'm going to turn it back to Yesenia for just a brief few minutes to share another example of a similar situation from El Salvador.
Yeah, I think we also don't have a whole lot of time, but I'll just briefly say, I think that these kinds of projects are promoted and enforced despite mass resistance. And this is very clear in the situation in El Salvador with water privatization, which there's been a decades-long struggle with the masses taking to the streets in order to push back against water privatization, which the IDB since the late 90s has been financing support for politicians for them to be able to sell privatization under other names. And so now we have words like private-public partnerships as well, which are really just no different than what has been pushed in the past. And the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the 2000s, in the first couple decades of the 2000s, has been also forcing the U.S. Embassy, forcing El Salvador to change its legal framework under public-private partnerships. And the mass is pushing back still and saying, no, water cannot be in this framework. But then the elites pushed by the right wing and pushed by the U.S. Embassy, including water management systems, for example, to fall under public-private partnerships as well, and saying you can't get this money unless you change your laws to allow private sector interest in these very essential services, again, as there's mass resistance against it. And I think the next presenter is Xochitl.
Yeah, I just don't see the slides on my end. Hi, folks. Thank you again. Thank you, Compas, for setting up the first half of this presentation. I'm going to take a deep dive into pillar number 2, combating corruption and strengthening democratic governments and advancing the rule of law. And what we're essentially going through is a plan that the White House had outlined and presented to address root causes of migration. And if folks know who the people in this picture are, please drop it in the chat if you recognize who I'm going to be talking about briefly in this slide. If you could leave your reaction in the chat as well. So we're going to really expose the hypocrisy behind this pillar and how the United States has, for decades, like the compañeras have already said, kind of used the same narrative that the Biden administration is trying to repackage as something novel, like Yesenia mentioned, to really kind of keep this line of continuation that allows them to have a military occupation in the region for their own interests as an empire. And essentially the people here in this picture, if you don't recognize them, is Juan Orlando Hernandez and his brother, Tony Hernandez, who is currently serving a life sentence in prison for smuggling kilos of cocaine and being an integral part of the drug trafficking kind of cartel networks that move throughout Central America, even Mexico. And is the brother of the current president of Honduras, which the United States has always supported and backed, which the United States is continually backing under the Biden-Harris administration. Even as the United States has filed documents of evidence, clear evidence against this current president of Honduras and his family, the United States has not in any way, shape, or form made a significant kind of maneuver or even gesture to try to distance themselves from this government. They have continued to fund its military projects, and there is no hope really that we're going to see a big change or a big break from this specific corrupt government in the region by the Biden-Harris administration, which honestly is disgusting. So as we can see here, there is a very clear continuation the United States has done to continue to fund corrupt governments in the region to continue their own projects. And it's a clear case against Ho, who the pueblo organizado in Honduras has been organizing against for over 10 years. He's currently serving a second illegal presidency, a second illegal term after 2017 fraudulent elections. And we're actually expecting elections in November in Honduras. We're expecting there to be a potentially either his handpicked person to continue as the president, or maybe even himself to retain his seat as the president in power to save himself from all these charges against him and his administration. We can go on to the next slide, please. So I also want to talk about specifically some agencies that have been created throughout the years and very different cases for each one of these countries. When we talk about the CISIG, the MAXI, and the CS, these are actually formations that the United States has backed and supported along with the Organization of American States. And I'm going to talk briefly on what has taken place in the last 2 years. So this is not something that has happened in the 70s or 80s. This is happening right now, right? So the CICIG in Guatemala, the International Commission Against Impunity, has been dismantled in the last couple of years under the current president of Guatemala, who is Yamatei, whose family and people close to him are closely linked to actually people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Guatemala who were funding and supporting and were actually generals who were doing the massacring of indigenous people during the Civil War in Guatemala. So this is the current president of Guatemala, Yamatei, who along with his administration have also assured that the FESI, the Fiscalía Especializada contra la Impunidad, have also been greatly weakened under his administration because they were leading investigations into his current government. So the MAXI in Honduras, which is a similar agency also backed again by the United States and the OIS, supported by the United States and the OIS, has been, its mandate has expired under Ho, and the president himself kind of allowed this to take place as ongoing investigations were happening in his government. And this doesn't speak to other institutions that exist for transparency and trying to hold accountable any type of justice happening in the country, or any processes of justice to happen in the country, right? But the MAXI specifically has been dismantled in the last 2 years under Ho. Then I want to go to the CS, which is something pretty new in El Salvador, and the current president of El Salvador in 2019 kind of used it as his electoral platform to bring forth advancements, right, when it comes to transparency and justice in El Salvador. But very quickly, in less than 2 years, this summer in June, the Attorney General, along with the president, kind of went ahead and dismantled the CS as it was, because there were ongoing investigations against his current administration. Next slide, please. So out of that, as these agencies kind of crumble and are being actively attacked by the powers that be in the region, the United States' response was like, well, that's too bad, but we're going to move forward and bring our own plan, which is kind of suspicious, right? Super sus. But when we talk about what they actually are trying to get done, is they're going to turn a blind eye to corruption in the country, violence in the country, and impunity because it serves them. So as these crumble, the United States, along with the State Department, along with the Special Envoy to Northern Triangle, Ricardo Zúñiga, if you don't know who he is, I suggest you Google this man. And the State Department announced their anti-corruption task force, which here clearly outlines the 3 kind of criminal division agencies that they're going to use to go ahead and create this anti-corruption task force. And if y'all can really take your time, read through this slide, but I want to just put an emphasis on the fact that this is really focusing on crimes against US law and US law in the region, and not really the kind of crimes that affect people and forcibly displace them in their own country. So when it comes down to it, they want to make sure that they can surveil and fichar, right, all the people who are going ahead and carrying out illegal activities, but really only if it affects them. And at the very end, they also kind of mentioned that this task force is going to be supported by the FBI International Corruption Unit, US Drug Enforcement Administration, Homeland Security, as well as legal attachés and country representatives within the US Embassy. Along with the Justice Department Task Force and the Department of, sorry, I can't read the end of that, but I wanted to just really outline the kind of massive amount of resources that they're putting behind this. And again, not really getting to the heart of the issues that are affecting people in their day-to-day lives. This is really the United States assuring that they can control, surveil, and navigate all the systems of control of illegal activities within the country and assure that they can continue to fund it the way that best serves them. Can we go to the next slide, please? Another tool that came out of the Biden-Harris administration, which is honestly not useful, when it comes down to it, it doesn't have any teeth. This is essentially them saying that these are the corrupt people that we've identified within Central America under contemporary and kind of within the last decade, folks who have been involved within government. And this is something that has taken precedence from the Engels list. The folks are familiar with this list that came out in the 80s, which again was a similar type of method or tool to just name corrupt people and say, we're not going to give them refuge in the United States and we're not going to allow them to enter the United States. Again, not getting to any root causes of why people are being forcibly displaced. And in the pictures here, I'm going to just share that there was a list that came out, right? 14 people from El Salvador, 20 from Guatemala, 21 from Honduras. But in the last 6 months, in July, for instance, there was a mass movement of people, mass protests really of people asking, demanding that the president of Guatemala resign. Renuncia, Gimate, miente, engaña, y roba. Gimate is not a person named within this list, right? Juan Orlando Hernandez is not a person named within this list at all. And again, when we saw Kamala Harris go into Guatemala just a few months ago, she kind of established this ongoing relationship with Gematai, with the current president of Guatemala. And as we are seeing right now, continuing to fund this externalization of borders that is very key in the Guatemala-Mexican border. And so while the people of the countries are naming their oppressors very actively, very viciously, the United States is again turning a blind eye and coming up with superficial solutions on their part, which is really not solutions at all. And the bottom of that, we see a woman also calling Bukele, the current president of El Salvador, a dictator. And this picture was taken in October 17th of this year. So less than a month ago, right? We're seeing that these mass movements of the pueblo, of El Pueblo Organizado within the region are going forth and naming their oppressors, and the United States is continuing to fund them.
Thank you, Xochitl. I quickly want to acknowledge some comments from our audience members, Rose, Theresa, Kathy. We agree that this is a very overwhelming reality for Central Americans. And these are the dynamics and the conditions that so many Central Americans are fleeing. And I'm going to speak to another critical pillar of the US strategy, which is organized under Pillar 4. And please stay tuned. We are going to talk about solutions. We are going to talk about ways to get involved and support actual solutions to address these root causes. Now, the other critical pillar that I want to discuss is countering and preventing violence, extortion, and other crimes perpetrated by criminal gangs, trafficking networks, and other organized criminal organizations. Now, the governments in Honduras, as you all have heard, and Guatemala are controlled by organized criminal networks. You essentially have narco mafia states funded by US taxpayer dollars, and this plan proposes to keep funding them to combat organized crime, which is simply absurd. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. The first and most prominent piece of the strategy is the logic of professionalizing security forces, which is code for US military training of Central American military and police. Now, the image that you're seeing on the screen are 4 members of the senior enlisted advisory corps at the WINSEC, the School of the Americas, in Fort Benning, Georgia this year. Now, if we can go to the next slide, please. Now, we understand that the US cannot train or fund corruption out of these security forces when the entire state apparatus is corrupt and in the service of criminal organizations. The idea that the US will make more investments in training to professionalize security forces is troubling, because additional military support from the US threatens to further legitimize and embolden evidently corrupt security forces in Central America to be more efficient in what they're already doing. And you already know what they're doing. Can we go to the next slide? The solution to the issue is often proposed is to create more specialized professional units to conduct more vetting and be more selective of where US security funds go, but this hasn't worked in the past. In the case of former Honduran Congressman Xochitl shared, Tony Hernandez, a US federal court convicted him to life in prison for his leadership in the violent 15-year state-sponsored drug trafficking conspiracy that also implicated his brother, Juan Orlando Hernandez. The US court found that Tony moved over 185,000 kilos of cocaine, secured millions of dollars in bribes to Honduran officials, and a very important fact found by the court, Tony used members of the Honduran military and national police to get all this done. The US acts as if the drug war in the region combats major drug trafficking, but it really just gives military aid recipients control over drug corridors. We can go to the next slide, please. Now, Lostiges is an elite unit of the National Police in Honduras, funded and trained by the US with support from Jungla unit of the Colombian National Police. The unit was created back in 2013 by law and under the proposition of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was then the president of the National Congress. In June 2014, the US ambassador to Honduras personally attended the Tigris, the first graduation of the Tigris unit in Tegucigalpa. And just months after the graduation, several members of this US-sponsored elite anti-drug trafficking units were suspected of stealing $1.3 million from drug seizure operations. Some members were prosecuted and trials are still pending. Even after this, and go to the next slide, please. Even after this, US Green Berets, your taxpayer dollars, continued training and professionalizing the Tigris security forces in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, with substantial support from the US State Department. After the fraudulent elections in 2017, the Tigris, which are supposed to combat drug trafficking, were activated in the government's crackdown against protesters and social movements. We can go to the next slide, please. It's important to mention that just last year, Honduran military police kidnapped and disappeared the Garifuna leader and other young men from Triunfo de la Cruz community in Honduras. And you can hear more about this in the next panel where Miriam Miranda will be speaking. An October transmission from Orphany showed how private and national security forces are working together to evict Garifuna communities in order to clear their ancestral lands for the construction of the sedes, these autonomous zones for neoliberal economic investment that threaten to displace many more Hondurans. The drug war is often used as justification for the presence of the military in Garifuna communities. It's important to recognize that due to public pressures and solidarity efforts, some foreign military financing is being withheld, but this is only a fraction of the help. There are many avenues, including trainings that help US military and security aid continue to keep flowing to Central America. There are many more channels, including direct funding from the Department of Defense. This is also why the idea of vetting, again, poses a problem. It keeps US security aid flowing to Central America to end up funding the same dynamics between politically corrupt use of military power and violent repression of social movements. Of course, the drug war is used to justify military presence and violent actions against communities. And I'll end with the example of, next slide, please. In Guatemala, we know this is the Phoenix mine, the El Estor state of siege, which is another example of how military forces are weaponized against social movements. In Guatemala, the US-backed military police were given emergency powers to support illegal mining. The Phoenix mine in El Estor is one of the largest nickel mines in the hemisphere. The project and its multinational owners have been accused of human rights abuses and illegally expanding operations. In 2019, the Constitutional Court ordered the mine to close, but the mine has continued to operate illegally. Indigenous leaders began demonstrating and blocking the mine, and Guatemalan military national police responded by attacking protesters to resume the full and illegal operation of the nickel mine. The president of Guatemala declared a state of siege in the region, making illegal the assembly of indigenous communities resisting the operations of the mine. Now, back to that urgent desire to do something about it, right? Like this is very stark, very overwhelming. And again, these are the conditions that people are fleeing. So to propose all of this as solutions, it's really absurd of this administration. Now, let's talk about solutions and what we can do about it. Next slide, please. First and foremost, it's critical that the US needs to honestly reckon with its past in Central America, and not just political interventions and military interventions in the last 10 years, but historically. The US needs to take responsibility for its role in destabilizing the three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, publicly recognize this, release still classified documents related to past interventions, and accept that migrants are a result of past and present US actions. In this way, the US can begin to grant legal status to immigrants, accept asylum seekers, and really reckon with the past and influence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. We're gonna share a timeline of US intervention in the chat for your review. And we'll continue with conclusions, what you can do and how you can get involved. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you for staying with us up until this point. Thank you to all the compas who have shared so much important information. And yeah, I'm gonna continue on with more of what should happen. So the US really needs to stop centering corporate and private sector interests in foreign policy and within its plan to supposedly address migration from Central America. CISPES has been joined by many other organizations as well in the last year related to our campaign to end harmful aid to Central America. And this is through the appropriations process. We've been asking congressional representative, or we've been asking Congress to withhold aid that promotes private sector interests within essential services like water, electricity, healthcare, and education, as well as withholding funding from major infrastructure projects that are opposed by local communities and that displace people. So we've gotten some inroads with that. There was language that Congress did pass around the extractivist, like the major infrastructure projects that are displacing people that are opposed. And of course, it'll be a matter of whether or not it remains in the final budget version that gets agreed upon with the Senate as well. But the piece about the private-public partnerships and the interests of the private sector, that we still have a lot more work to do in terms of pressuring that change, which makes a lot of sense that Congress, that our politicians are deeply committed to, this kind of trickle-down economics model. So we have, I put some links here that folks can look to this element of the campaign. There was a letter that was signed by 130 organizations, solidarity organizations in the US and in Central America that are about the harmful impacts of US economic policy. And you can find that in the bit.ly, and more information at that hashtag, as well as the cispes.org/takeaction link. Thank you so much again, everybody.
Thank you, Yesenia. And the next conclusion, and this is also related to another action item, is that the US just simply must stop propping up repressive and authoritative regimes in all three countries, in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. And I feel like sometimes there's this like false question, because we're like, well, what should the US do? Like the US first and foremost needs to stop doing harm, right? Like stop. And so that's just the #1 first step. And this includes cutting immediately all military and police aid to three countries. And as Yesenia mentioned, there has also been proposals about this in the appropriation process. And there are also bills in both the Senate and the House with regards to Honduras to cut military and police aid. And those bills are very important to keep supporting and to keep pushing, because this is kind of like the bare minimum of what the US needs to do, is to stop financing and training the military and the police in Central America, and in all the different ways that they do, because as Lulu mentioned, this money goes through so many different channels.
And I'll add that it's critical to stop selling weapons to all three countries as well. And that's a lot of the work that John Lindsay Poland shares, and we want to echo that as well.
And the last one that I can speak to briefly, like I mentioned, there's upcoming elections taking place in Honduras and also Nicaragua taking place tomorrow, right? And what we're asking for, not really asking, demanding at this point, and what the pueblos are demanding is the US to stop intervening and allow for them to be the ones to choose their own governments and do so by the democratic processes that they have fought for, that have taken the deaths of thousands of people as well as decades of organizing to be able to get to this point. We understand that there's issues and there is deep-seated corruption within these governments, but there's also movements to try to save, rescatar what has been built up until this point, and for people to be able to choose who governs them moving forward.
So thank you, Xochitl, thank you, Yesenia, thank you, Lulu. We are going to now use the remaining moments for some questions and folks from the audience. And so I'm looking in the chat and also just to acknowledge some of the comments that people can see. So there's a presentation and analysis of the Biden-Harris administration plan as well by Migrant Roots Media. And in the chat, people can see the report there. Just want to highlight that for everybody. Let's see. And then we have a number of other comments from folks. So people say there's questions about being unable to copy and paste these links. We will be sending everybody some follow-up emails after this presentation. And so we will be including a lot of the links that are both the information in the slideshow, the different actions, the links to the organization website. So if you aren't able to copy and paste them all, then we'll be sure to share them afterward with folks. And so just be attentive to your email. Then there are, let's see, are there any other questions that folks have or that I am missing here? Questions.
I see a message from Robert Rovner. What benefits do US Congress people get from supporting these regimes?
Anybody like to start with that?
I can go. I think that first, like as we've seen throughout the decades, the United States has a very clear interest in the region for the sake of plantations, right? Growing fruit and growing commodities that we purchase and use in our country and pay the most for comparative to what prices cost in the region. So really the interest continues to be extractivism, exploitation of natural resources, and exploitation of labor, the labor that takes place within the region, and also the workers that immigrate from the region to the United States. So there's very clear kind of continuation of ensuring that people are either displaced or murdered, massacred, like we saw during the civil wars, in order to take over territories and lands that they can use to exploit for their own reasons. And we continue to see that with the dispossession and displacement happening around rivers, right? Something that a lot of pueblos in small towns really need and depend on for their access to day-to-day water. So this is kind of ongoing, and we're continuing to see that even with the Partnership for Central America that the Biden-Harris administration has outlined. It's made up of corporations that are excited to start the new projects in Central America in order to exploit its land and exploit its people.
Thank you, Xochitl. I want to acknowledge that Dana Frank, la compañera Dana, is in the chat sharing information on HR 1574, the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, and how critical and important it is that these bills get passed to cut all security aid to Honduras, and that being the case for Guatemala and El Salvador as well. Now I have another question for panelists here. Yesenia, Brigitte, please feel free to chime in. Now, why is it so critical that the US acknowledge migrants and folks who are displaced because of these policies as, in fact, asylum seekers and not economic migrants, as so often they're reduced to? And why does the US refuse to acknowledge them as refugees or asylum seekers and rather continues pinpointing to horizontal violence, pinpointing to poverty and that desire for just economic mobility?
I can comment a little bit to that. I mean, and I think it just kind of reminds me so much of the situation during the Civil War in El Salvador, when Salvadoran migrants were also not given access to asylum status as the US was financing the military dictatorship there. And I think, yeah, it kind of goes to that same acknowledgement. It would require the US to acknowledge that all of the money that they're sending, they've never stopped sending like hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to the region. And so what the conditions that exist there now are highly constructed by that money that has continued to flow for the same purposes. And so I think in part it would require an acknowledgement of the impacts of that.
I think that's exactly right. And it really would, I think the idea and the language that is used is language that no one's responsible for. It's like they're planted, like the US likes to use words like poverty, it just kind of exists in a vacuum, right? That's what they're trying to push. And if you admit that people are asylum seekers, then they're fleeing a state that is directly responsible. And in this case, the US is literally propping up these governments, and especially in the case of Honduras, like Juan Orlando Hernandez would not be in power right now if it were not for the United States, right? He lost the last elections, people were in the streets for months, despite being shot at. And it's because of the US embassy recognizing him as president, that he is president right now. And so all these drug trafficking cases and all of that, it's all about geopolitical control for the United States. And that is why people are fleeing, and that is why people's lives are being destroyed so that the US can have control, because Juan Orlando is their friend, even though obviously there's all these drug trafficking cases and so much hypocrisy. And so if the US admits that people are asylum seekers, they basically have to admit the repression of the states that the US is basically keeping in power because of its own geopolitical interests. And just to mention, to follow up on that, just the bills, as Dana put in the chat, are extremely important with regards to Honduras, as well as the appropriation process for all three countries. And we'll be sending out in the follow-up emails, the links to the bills in Congress, actions that people can take, where you can ask your congresspeople and your senators to support these. And we'll be really following up with as much information as we can. And I'd like to really thank all of the folks who have joined us today for listening to us and for being here and for being part of this workshop. And especially a big thank you to Xochitl and to Yesenia and to Lulu for sharing. And really just thank you to everyone for listening. And we will kind of give everyone a break. We have a brief break right now. People need to go get some water, go to the bathroom. And in 15 minutes, we will come back for our third panel, which will be fantastic as well. And so we really want to encourage everybody, just if you need to do anything, to do it right now during this break so that you don't miss the third panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.